where we're looking at the Gospel of Mark. And I'm going to give a brief introduction to the Gospel of Mark. Now, Mark was, written by Mark. Mark traveled with Paul and Barnabas, and then with the Apostle Peter. It's really interesting in the book of Acts, we read how Paul was a cousin of Barnabas. Sorry, I apologize. Mark was a cousin of Barnabas. And that Barnabas, Mark, and Paul went on a missionary journey. Something happened and Mark left in the heat of trouble. And then a little bit later on, Paul and Barnabas were going to go on another missionary journey. Barnabas wanted to bring his cousin Mark. And Paul said no. And they had such a huge falling out over this that you actually never hear about Barnabas and Mark in the rest of the book of Acts. What's really interesting is later on, in Paul's letter to the Colossians, you read the fact that Mark was there with Paul in prison in Rome. And then again in 1 Peter, Mark is called Peter's son. That's a wonderful way of saying, this is my dear student. This is somebody who's my student, the one who's going to take up after me when I'm done. And so we see the fact that Mark traveled extensively with the apostles. Now, Mark wrote this gospel roughly in 60 AD. This was a time of great persecution by the Emperor Nero. And so people were getting killed. People were getting run out of town. They were losing their businesses. Everything bad was happening. In fact, during this time period, this persecution, Paul and Peter were both killed. And the themes in Mark reflect all of this. The themes in Mark reflect all these things that are going on in this time, where Mark is telling the story of who Jesus is. So let's look at these themes. Some of the themes in Mark are conversion, discipleship, suffering, and fear. Conversion, discipleship, suffering, and fear. So I want to go ahead and look at conversion. Conversion it's how people come to an understanding of who Jesus is. And in Mark, we have this theme of understanding who Jesus is. They ask questions, they want to know. And they ask questions of Jesus, Jesus answers. Jesus asks questions of them, and they struggle to come with a good answer. And so there's a journey of coming to a deeper understanding of who Jesus is. But conversion is also initiation into the kingdom of God. It's an initiation. When I was in Boy Scouts, I had to go through initiation into Boy Scouts. I had to go through the rules, I had to go through the pledge, I had to go through getting the sash, and I was initiated into the group. Throughout the Gospel of Mark, we see this initiation into the kingdom of God. There's also then the theme of discipleship. Discipleship, to be a disciple, is to be a follower of a rabbi. What it means to be a student of a rabbi. And so we see this theme of learning what it means to be like Jesus. And what this means is it's what it means to walk with Jesus. What does it mean to walk with Him? What does it mean to be a follower of Jesus Christ? What are the prices? What does it entail? And we see this theme of discipleship throughout the Gospel of Mark. There's also the theme of suffering, especially in the second half of Mark. There's a suffering involved. There's a suffering in following Jesus. In fact, there's a call to suffer for Jesus. He says to pick up our cross and follow Him. He says that if we want to save our life, we must lose our life first in order to save it. He says that to James and John, if you want to be like me, you must suffer. And it's a call to enter into the sufferings in order to be like Jesus. And so throughout Mark, this recurring theme, especially in the second half, of suffering, comes out. We can see this and how Jesus explains suffering and how there's a call that we need to enter into the suffering. And finally, there's this theme of fear. There are many times where we read how the disciples were afraid. We read how they were afraid about what Jesus did. They were afraid of what he was doing. In fact, the gospel itself ends with the woman being afraid at the tomb. See, there's a fear in giving all to follow Jesus. There's a fear in giving all to follow Jesus. Especially in the day and age that Mark wrote the gospel, there was a huge fear in following Jesus. We see how this theme of fear can connect, not just to the Roman Christians, but to us as well today. There's also a fear of going against the norm and being different from the rest. Because the disciples were constantly called to be different, to be set apart. And there was a fear involved in following Jesus and being different and set apart. Now, all of this, the themes that we see here, and the Gospel of Mark as a whole, is like a spiritual journey, or you can call it a spiritual pilgrimage. You see, Jesus is walking with these 12 people, these 12 students, these 12 disciples, and many other people are following around. And it becomes a journey of discovery of who Jesus Christ is and what he has come to do. And it's a journey of the 12 disciples in understanding who Jesus is and how they can follow him. And in the spiritual journey, there are three things here that come up: quest and transformation and formation. Quest, transformation, and formation. Let's look at those real quick. Quest is seeking and exploring. There's this call to the disciples to follow me. Jesus says to Simon and Andrew, follow me. Jesus says to Levi, the tax collector, follow me. People come up to Jesus and they ask him questions. What is the greatest commandment? What do I do to have salvation? And they come to him and they want questions. They're seeking and exploring and they're asking questions. They're trying to see who Jesus is. And in the spiritual journey, the spiritual pilgrimage, this quest is a quest for insight into who Jesus is. It's exploring, it's seeking. And the disciples in the beginning of the Gospel of Mark are trying to see who Jesus is and what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus.